All of us know that AI is going to change the future of the world. There's a battle in AI going on between the United States and China. You never want to bet against China because you have a country that has the largest amount of STEM graduates, right? Science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Most Americans, I think they look at China almost like a North Korea. It's one guy at the top. It's not. It's completely different. China is run by engineers, and the United States is run by lawyers. The rise of China is certainly something that has challenged that U.S. hegemony because now countries have an option. Hello, everyone. My name is Cyrus Janssen. I'm a geopolitical analyst focusing on China and this ever-changing world that we now live in.
And it is changing faster and faster every day. It seems like we're in kind of an exponential jump right now. So maybe we could start by getting our heads around what are the kind of equivalent companies that are in China that we can kind of use in American terms for reference. Like, it seems like they have sort of the equivalent of Facebook and Google. And then is there kind of an OpenAI? Maybe you could just give us a broad landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. So Dylan, Wes, thanks so much for having me on the podcast. I think all of us know that AI is going to change the future of the world. And I think right now what's interesting is there's a battle in AI going on between the United States and China, right? The two biggest superpowers in the world. They're definitely the two biggest influencers in the AI space as well. So it's kind of an exciting time because I think when you talk to people in the AI space, I think there's a lot of, very bullish sentiment from people because, at the end of the day, it's about trying to create systems and work towards better technology that's going to help our world evolve and let us all live a better life. So as far as the companies, we have the big companies that are in China now, they're all using AI. So, you kind of look at, for example, Alibaba, you're looking at Tencent, and then Huawei would be really the main one that's the kind of a big player here that would be kind of similar to your Nvidia because they're developing the chips and the technology that's going to be driving that. So, for example, Nvidia has obviously been in the headlines the last couple of months. Jensen Huang, Nvidia CEO, very bullish on China. He's been going to China for over 30 years. Just gave a fantastic interview, actually, where he really talked a lot about, the truth about China. That interview actually was on a pretty big YouTube channel. Didn't get a lot of views, something around like, maybe 200,000 views. But I think there's a lot of people that really should see that interview. And I did take some clips out and I did share that on my social media. And, he just said some really good stuff about how fast China is growing and how the key thing with China that we have to understand is that when the government gets behind something, that's where the industry is going to move. And so there's not a government in the world that can move as fast and efficiently as China. And it makes sense, right? It's a one-party state. So if the party says, hey, we're moving towards AI, like this is going to be a big priority for us, well, guess what? And, any company that's going to be working in that respective field, they're going to get additional funding. They're going to have easier, a green light for access to technologies, to permitting, to everything like that. There's less red tape for them to go through if it's in the interest of the government and the nation. And so that's what we're really seeing right now is a big movement from China and a big movement from these tech companies.
Yeah. And do you feel like that is a methodology that's going to beat America in the long run? Do you think they'll end up having the most cutting edge models?
Well, I think, there's a couple interesting case studies that we can look at. I think, earlier this year, all of us, in this AI space, we're looking at DeepSeek, which I think was a really fundamental shift in the market because all of a sudden, I remember, listening to Sam Altman, talking about OpenAI. There's a very famous clip where there was an Indian venture capitalist who said, hey, Sam, what if we wanted to start something from scratch? What if we wanted to try to build something that could compete against an OpenAI? And Sam Altman, very famously just kind of looked at him and laughed. And it's like, don't even try, like impossible. Like you can't even begin to get to our level because we're so far advanced. We're this, we're that. And it was a very arrogant, statement from Sam Altman because, he thinks it's like, oh, I've got all the technology. I've got all the cards. And then you see what DeepSeek has been able to do is they were able to develop it on a shoestring budget, essentially have a model that is very compatible with an OpenAI and in some tests actually perform better. And, this is something that I think what's really interesting here, guys, is I would say you never want to bet against China because you have a country that has the largest amount of STEM graduates, right? Science, technology, engineering, mathematics. So when you go to when you really do your research and you're starting to look into China, and this is this interview that I listened to Jensen Huang, he said they have some of the best entrepreneurs, some of the best engineers, because they're coming from the most advanced schools. If we actually look at Chinese schools and how they're ranking around the world, actually Chinese universities are catching up with their American counterparts. So, to answer your question, is China going to win this race? I think, I don't know if it's a winner and a lose. I think that you have two great countries working towards something, right? There's amazing AI developments coming out of China. Obviously, there's amazing AI developments coming out of the United States. I think what I always do and what my big work on my YouTube channel is always talking about how the United States and China complement each other, right? And again, if you have a bunch of engineers, whether they're scientists or engineers or astronauts, whatever field it is, if it's dedicated to science, they typically don't really let politics get in the way. They really want to work on, their respective field. And so they're all about collaboration. So I'm very much one. And how do we actually, create a better AI experience for the world? And, if China is moving that needle and the United States is too, like, how do we complement each other and how do we actually work together? Because we all live in one planet. So why don't we make something that we can all benefit from?
Yeah, it seems like one of the biggest sort of advantages the US has right now is still chips. So it's chip production, Nvidia, et cetera. And so I guess there's some myths floating around about whether or not it's possible for China to catch up in chip design. And even recently, I think there's, it seems like they're saying that they have their own chips to run their own models, et cetera. Some people are suggesting maybe that's a little bit of a bluff in order to try to get US to sell more NVIDIA chips to China. What do you follow in all of that? Like, can they recreate what NVIDIA and Taiwan did in terms of chip manufacturing, or is that not going to happen? And if so, kind of how does that play out?
Yeah, it's a great question, Wes. So I think there's two things we want to look at. Number one, we have to look at where China has been and where they've come from. So, for example, a few years ago, we would look at the chip production in China compared to the United States, and we could easily say that China was, 3 to 5 years behind, right? And in that terms of chip development, a 5-year head start is monumental, right? I mean, it's basically you're so far ahead that you're never going to be able to catch up, because obviously 5-year head start, the United States is going to keep refining and getting better. Now, again, what's happened in these last, I would say 5 years specifically, is that China has narrowed that gap down a lot. And this is something that Jensen Huang, actually said very specifically in this interview. He said, a lot of people think that China is, years behind. Is it 2 years? Is it 3 years? In Jensen Huang's own words, he said, they're nanoseconds behind. They're really right behind us, and they are closing the gap faster and faster than we could ever imagine. I remember Eric Schmidt, former Google CEO, he had a similar statement where he said, our lead in AI is so big that China will never catch up. And I'm confidently to say that. Like, I'm going to say, it's from now on, like, we've won the race. There's never going to come a point where China will catch up. And again, I think my message to our viewers here is, you never want to be in that position where you're kind of betting against China, a country full of mathematicians and engineers and people. Again, like, China really functions well when their back is against the corner, and you have no other option but to kind of invent yourself out of it in a way. So again, does the United States have a chip lead? Absolutely, they do. Is China closing the gap? Absolutely, they are. And I would say that it's very possible within a few years that honestly China does catch up to that, and there won't be that strategic advantage for the United States. Now, the interesting thing is when we look at NVIDIA chips, you've got the A100s, which is the most advanced AI chips. Now, the U.S. government did not allow NVIDIA to sell those chips to China because of fears of military use or national security. And so NVIDIA said, oh, that's fine. What we're going to do is we're going to make a subpar version. We're going to make the B100s. We're going to make the H20s, and we're going to sell these chips to China. Now, don't forget this. This is a very valuable market for the United States, especially for a company like NVIDIA. The China market to NVIDIA is worth about $15 billion. So this is very lucrative. This is why Jensen Huang is literally flying to Beijing all the time, meeting with trade organizations, talking with people, because it's like, hey, look, we're making $15 billion worth of revenue over here. That's not a small amount. We want to sell the best chips in the world. We think NVIDIA is the best. We want to sell it to everybody. So Jensen Huang is very much that businessman and somebody that's just very practical, right? NVIDIA makes the best chips. We want to always dominate the chip market, and we would like to see that everybody uses NVIDIA chips, whether you're in the United States, China, or any other country for that matter. And so I think what you're seeing right now is a very interesting thing that's happened within the last 2 weeks is that at first point, you had Joe Biden administration. They blocked Nvidia selling these A100 chips. Okay. So what China did is they bought a ton of the H20 chips. And this is, again, very lucrative for Nvidia, very lucrative for Nvidia shareholders. China's buying, let's say, they could take 20 or 30 of these H20 chips and they could basically reconfigure them to then equal the output of, say, one, A100 chip. So they can basically just buy a large quantity and be able to compute the same amount and at the same time. Obviously, it just needs a little bit more chips, but they could be able to make that calculation. Now, what has happened is that because of this trade war and because of the tensions between the United States and China, China has kind of a plan B. And that plan B is make sure that we're developing that domestic market very intensely. And so Huawei has now been able to catch up and been able to reach a point where they're able to match that same production quality of the H20. Again, not the A100, the high level, but the H20. So now this is the kind of a whole 180-degree change. Donald Trump has said, okay, you know what? We're going to allow Nvidia to start selling again to China, and we're going to be able to sell that H20 chip. But then literally about 3 days later, China came out and said, you know what? We are not going to actually buy them anymore. In fact, the Chinese government is now going to ban Chinese companies from buying the H20 chip because we don't need it anymore. And we want to make sure that our domestic market is being fueled and that companies like Huawei are getting those sales because those sales are going to drive further R&D and it's going to benefit us because our goal in the long term is certainly to close that gap down. So it's kind of a long-winded answer there, but it really, there's a lot of moving pieces in this story and you really need to understand what's been happening over the last, 3 to 5 years.
Can you explain where money kind of comes into play? Because we just see like kind of ungodly amounts of money in the big tech companies. I mean, it seems like if you don't have $1 trillion to spend over the next 10 years, if you're not doing $100 billion in infrastructure, then you're not going to compete with Microsoft because that's what they can do. You're not going to compete with Tesla and Elon Musk. You're not going to compete with Microsoft. So how many $1 trillion 10-year plans can they put together? And would they be government funded or is there enough big companies there to give us a run for the money?
That's a good question. There's, again, it goes back to that first point I mentioned as far as if the government really wants to move forward that industry, they're going to certainly, put together tax incentives. They're going to put together, proposals that are going to allow those companies to flourish. So I think, for example, we brought up Tesla just now, the entire electric vehicle sector. This is a very bullish market for China. It's no surprise that, for example, BYD is an amazing company. They're number one company in the world now as far in terms of actual auto sales, as far as the quantity of sales. And so again, what happens is what's very interesting, and I'd like people to know this about China, is that in China, we always tend to think of China as a very authoritarian government. And for example, you've got Xi Jinping at the top. It's a one man rules the party and everything comes from Beijing. Actually, China's not like that at all. China is actually a very interesting society because everything goes down to your local economies. And so I'm going to give you an example for our viewers to understand. It's no different than the United States where, for example, we have 50 states, right? So the laws here in Nevada are very different than Texas and California. Some states have no state income tax. Some have, very high state income tax. Some industries it would be taxed less than others. So it works the same way as far as the provinces in China. So for example, in this electric vehicle industry, there was a certain province that said, hey, look, the government wants to incentivize this, and we want companies to come to our province and build their things. So what we're going to do on the provincial level is that if you come and you build a electric vehicle company here, we are not going to charge you a local tax. Right. So we're going to give you a massive advantage for coming here. And so, you can save a ton of money for that. Right. So obviously that worked. Right. A lot of companies came. And what happens is also in China is that you have it's a very cutthroat local market. And what that mean by that is, for example, there are hundreds of EV companies that are around in China. But what happens is that because of the competition domestically, it's so hard to survive that out of, let's say, the 100, maybe 80 to 90 of them are going to fail because they just simply can't get the numbers. They simply can't survive because they're going to get eaten up by the other competition. But again, if you can survive the local market in China, much like a BYD, you're going to be able to really achieve global sales. And if you could become the number one brand in China, you can easily go expand your brand around the world. That's not an issue because it's so hard to really kind of survive domestically because there's so much competition, even competition with other provinces. So like we always say, we kind of have a joke in China where it's like, you're talking about whether it's EVs or AI. Actually, the competition is like between Shanghai and Beijing, and then Beijing and Guangzhou. Like it's these actual provinces that are kind of competing against each other, trying to attract talent. And a lot of it goes through, local funding. And so it would be local governments and their budgets that are funding a lot of these things. And so that's something that a lot of people don't really understand about China. Again, we tend to think of it as this authoritarian, one man rules the entire country. For most Americans, I think they look at China almost like a North Korea. It's one guy at the top. It's not. It's completely different. And every province is different. All these different industries are very different. So there's a lot of, right now, AI. I mean, there's thousands and thousands of startups, coming in China. There's tech hubs all over the country. Again, there's, fundraising, being made as far as, trying to go IPO and things like that. So yeah, there's a lot of investment in this particular industry, and it is definitely going to be the future, as we all know.
So I'm curious, because I mean, here we do talk quite a bit on the US side about the race, the competition. Some people are worried about a potential war in the future, as sort of historically what happens is one sort of superpower eclipses another. There's usually some sort of a military conflict. So people are worried about that. People are worried about losing the AGI race between US and China. How does China, what's the Chinese perspective on this? Is there the same sort of hostility and competition and win at all costs, or is it a little bit more measured? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Wes. I mean, I think one thing I always want people to understand is that, China, when we talk about like the potential conflict escalation or potential confrontation with the United States, this is something that Chinese people and the Chinese government and China as a whole most certainly doesn't want. China has not been involved in a war since 1979 when it was involved in the Vietnam War. I mean, it was honestly, this is something that China is at the core of it is a very peaceful nation. They don't want war, and so I think what the thing is when you're looking at, a competition as far as, will China overtake the United States as the number one economy? Will China become the world number one superpower? I don't think it's necessarily China's goal. I don't think they have a goal of saying, look, we want to make sure that the United States fails and that China's number one. You got to remember, I mean, let's be honest, the Chinese economy is very interconnected to the U.S. economy. This is something that I talk about a lot is why trade is so important. So for example, I've been very vocal on my YouTube channel. I'm not for Donald Trump's trade war. I don't support the trade war. I'm very much for open trade with countries like China and every other country in the world, because I think we live in a global economy. I would like to do more trade between countries. And so I think when China, you're tapping into your natural strengths, right? China's strengths right now it obviously is its ability to manufacture. That's why it is the top trading partner to 120 countries around the globe. That's a huge thing to understand. And so again, it's kind of like, in the United States, we don't manufacture anymore, right? We've outsourced all of that overseas. We've shipped all those jobs overseas. So we manufacture very little compared to what, let's say, China does. And so our economy is more built on, finances and financial systems and, tech companies like, the Magnificent Seven stocks that we see that really, hold up around 30 to 35% of the stock market. But in China, obviously a lot of that power still comes in manufacturing and trade, which obviously gives them a lot of leverage around the world. You look at, for example, continents like Africa, 53 of 54 African nations, they actually pledged their allegiance to China earlier this year, saying, look, we really want to foster a closer relationship, with China. So yeah, it's definitely, I would say, China most definitely doesn't want a war. They definitely want to just rise peacefully. And it's kind of what I talk about is the rise of the multipolar world where, we're going to now have two superpowers, the United States and China. Both are going to be superpowers. It's not a unipolar world anymore where only the United States is going to be number one.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Sorry, and just let me follow up because I was kind of leading towards a particular thing here. And that is this. So China's been publishing tons of open source stuff, and it's been very impressive. I mean, DeepSeek, of course. There's been multiple other companies, Moonshot, Kimi Moonshot, many more. And it's not just on the large language models. It's also, we're seeing with robotics, Unitree has some open source stuff. It's very interesting to see. So Balaji, for example, kind of floated this idea or potential theory that seems to make sense to me, that it's an approach because, like you said, they dominate in terms of manufacturing the hardware.
Right.
And US, a lot of our companies, especially, in the tech space, they kind of lead the world in software.
Right.
So how do you take away sort of that edge? Well, if you sort of devalue the software by producing cheap, open source, readily available large language models and robotic software, et cetera, you sort of take away the big, Microsoft, Google, OpenAI's, their ability to generate revenue, kind of just undermine it a little bit. And China's still dominating on the hardware, producing robotics and widgets and whatnot, devices, et cetera. So is it possible that you're the perfect person to ask this question. Is it possible that the government is subsidizing the Chinese government or pushing or doing something in the background to be like, just open source? Like,
Right.
let's make sure that the US and everybody else is building on a Chinese open source systems models. And maybe that's kind of a strategic push by the Chinese government. Is that possible?
I wouldn't say it's, yeah, it's definitely possible. I mean, I think it's a very interesting question. I have to be honest, I haven't actually thought about that. I mean, you've brought up in a good point, right? If we build it all in open source, it kind of devalues the software aspect, right? And then maybe the United States wouldn't have that strong monopoly like a Microsoft or these other software companies that say, look, hey, this is where our leverage is. You can get the hardware from China, but you need the software from the US, so we still have the upper hand.
Right.
I mean, that's definitely possible. I think it's also where China is always kind of looking to where are the advanced industries that are going to kind of move our own domestic economy moving forward. And I mean, for example, let's take a look at robotics. One of the things that's very interesting is when we look at the population in China and we look at the forecast for the future, this is a very interesting trend. And what's actually happening, you look at China right now, 1.4 billion people. Well, China also has one of the oldest populations and has a very low birth rate. So what you're going to see in the next 75 years, okay, by the time 2100 comes up, by the end of this century, you're going to see China's population roughly go from 1.4 billion down to around 750 to 800 million. So, I mean, they're going to lose around 600 million people as terms of population, right? It's going to be under 1 billion people by the end of the century. So a big thing that people are saying is, look, China's not going to have the workforce to actually be building stuff anymore, right? They're not going to have the people to be able to work in those factories. But then you kind of counter that and you say, well, we're preparing for that because we're also leading in robots, right? We're leading the world in robot, deployment and how we're using robots. There are certain car factories, for example, that operate 24/7 in China, and they actually don't have lights on because they're all robotic, right? Wow. So you don't need lights on. They work 24/7, and it's just robots, actually manufacturing, and assembling the cars. So I think you have, you can kind of see one of the things that China does very well. And again, this is an advantage to a one-party state is when you're looking at, what is our plans, 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the line, where do we want to go? As we get towards this new year, 2026 coming up in just a few months, China is revealing its next 5th-year plan. So China is very famous. They always have the government launches a 5-year plan. And so this is the 15th I think this is the 15th consecutive 5-year plan that the Chinese government will release. And what's very good is it's actually a kind of a big event in China, because actually a lot of people kind of look forward to say like, all right, what is the government going to accomplish these next 5 years? And there's kind of a checks and balances there because, after the last 5 years, we want to say, okay, well, 5 years ago, we told you we're going to do this. Well, now let's kind of follow up on that. Let's see what we did. Did we actually accomplish those goals? How have we been doing? And China's government's very strategic in that way. There's an interesting saying is that, if we look at the US and China, China is run by engineers and, the United States is run by lawyers. And so when you have this kind of engineering background, if you actually look at the Communist Party of China, and you look at the Politburo, which is the top 9 guys, right, which obviously includes the president, Xi Jinping. But all of these guys have extensive, degrees. They have, engineering background. I mean, these are very well-educated men. Many of them have spent time, getting master's degrees in the United States. Like they speak an incredible level of English. These are very intelligent men that have a tremendous diplomatic experience, and so when you actually can kind of compare them to their American counterparts, it's very different because in America, you don't really need to have any experience. You can, in America, let's be honest, it's a popularity contest. You could be someone like Trump that doesn't have the actual political experience, but obviously he has the charisma. He has the ability to sell himself. He's an excellent marketer. And at the end of the day, he won the election, right? He was able to convince American people that, hey, I want to be the next president and I'm going to do a good job. People bought into that. He was elected. So it's a very different system. And so I think that's where, again, we're looking at these advantages and what China is planning for the future. So I'm very much looking forward to this next 5-year plan to see, what China is going to do and what they want to do. But I think the key thing here, gentlemen, is it's always, we have to remember that China is planning for the long term, looking at the trends, looking at where the industry wants to go. This is why, for example, you look at renewable energy. China is very, very big on renewable energy, which is quite an interesting thing when we talk about AI, because we actually look at, this is going to be a major issue for the United States is the power grid, right? Our power grid in the United States is not compatible for long-term AI development. When you look at how stagnant the growth of electricity is in the country, and China's just been going up because they, they actually, have invested heavily in all of these renewable energies, and they dominate solar, dominate wind turbines, dominate hydro, all of these things. And so their power generation is through the roof.
Oh, yeah. Because most of the time when I talk to somebody, they say, like, why should we worry about green energy when China's just polluting? But you're telling me that's not the case?
Oh, I mean, honestly, it's definitely, I don't want to paint China as this country that doesn't pollute. I mean, there's definitely still a lot of pollution, but actually, if you look at a per capita basis and what's happening, actually, the United States would be a bigger polluter. So if you actually look at the carbon emissions, for the country and how many people are there, and you look at the fact that, does China still burn coal? Absolutely. There's still coal burning factories that, exist and coal producing, let's say power plants, but they are absolutely leading in all of these renewable energies. Interesting side story. I did a video a few months ago talking about a new dam that is going to be built in the Tibetan mountains. Now, this dam is one of the most difficult projects that will ever be built because of the remote location. It's up in the Himalayan mountains near Tibet. I mean, you can think about the logistics of getting equipment. Building this thing is going to be impossible. But if there's one country in the world that's going to have the tooling, the engineering, the manpower to get this done, it's going to be China. By the time this is completed, this one dam will be able to produce enough energy from this one dam that is equivalent to the entire United Kingdom's energy output for a year. So, you're basically going to be able to produce that amount of power from one location in Tibet. And so, from a hydro dam. So it's going to be like the Three Gorges Dam that you might have heard of, the huge hydro dam out in West China. So it's going to be an even bigger, even better, even more ambitious project. China broke ground about 2 months ago on that project, and that will be completed. And so, yeah, I mean, when you look at the wind turbines, electric, I mean, it's quite impressive how much China has changed. I first went there in 2007, gentlemen, and that time was so different. The pollution was horrific. I mean, it was just. I remember days being in Shanghai where the pollution was so thick you could not see the color of the traffic lights. Right, you could not see if it was red or green because of the smog and the pollution. And to show how much that's transformed, and a lot of it is you go on the streets and 60% of the cars are EVs. Right, I would say within 5 to 10 years, you might not even see the gas cars anymore because the electric cars are becoming so popular and they're so nice, and it's so much better as far as reducing smog, pollution, things like that.
Yeah, and for people that I've shown the chart on this channel before where the production of electricity in China is just like you said, like goes up and up and up. I think I forget, it's a 10x or 5x, something like that times what US produces. And US is more or less stagnant since the year 2000, since the late 90s.
Yeah, exactly.
So I guess any thoughts about that? Like, what does the U.S. have to do to catch up, or just start, ramping up our energy production? Because I mean, right now it seems like we're already seeing a massive crunch with the amount of data centers that all these companies are now racing to put out. They're talking about 10 gigawatt plants, et cetera, 100, et cetera. So like, what's U.S. doing? Why can't we catch up? And do you see that changing, et cetera?
Well, I think right now, I mean, this is why it's so interesting with the U.S. politics because we have Donald Trump who is really doubling down on fossil fuels. Donald Trump is not a fan of renewable energy. I mean, for example, he just ended the tax credit for electric vehicles, in the United States. So there was a big push from Tesla, right? Get your new Tesla or order your Tesla before September 30th, to get that $7,500 federal tax credit. That's now been eliminated, and I mean, he wants to double down on fossil fuels and oil and basically the energy sources of the past. And so I think this is kind of again and I don't want to sound like I'm trying to praise China's government that they're more superior or better than the United States. I'm just trying to point out the differences. This is something where why China, for example, if they're moving forward as one party state saying, look, we're investing in renewable energy, this is the future, right? Power grids are going to be important. Data centers are going to need to be built. We need as much energy as possible, so it makes sense. Why not build that hydro dam in the Tibetan mountains? Why not invest in solar panels? Why not build wind turbines all over the country to tap into these natural renewable energy? I think if we look at nuclear energy, there's around 25 nuclear power plants under construction right now in China. So, I mean, there's no other country in the world that are building like the Chinese. Actually, they just had their first, model of the thorium, the molten, it's called like the thorium molten reactor. So they now have that one as well that has launched. So, I mean, this is why I really like to study China, because I always say this on my podcast is that, China is inventing the future technology that's going to change our world. And so I'm very bullish on that. I think it's fantastic. And when you go there and you experience it, you really realize like, wow, like China is really doing some impressive stuff. And again, this kind of goes full circle here to your earlier question. Is China doing this because they want to dominate the world? Or are they doing this trying to position themselves and their country in a better future? What's happened a lot in China, and what's when DeepSeek came out earlier this year, this was a very big thing for Chinese people. Like it's a source of pride. When I first went to China in 2007, Chinese people would never buy Chinese products, right? They didn't want to buy, let's say, a Chinese car, because it's like, well, I don't want a Chinese car. I want an American car. I want a European car because it's a status symbol. It's a prestige symbol, right? You would have, people would go to Starbucks back in 2007 and they would buy, a $5 or $6 latte, and they would hold it out with the Starbucks logo out so everyone can be like, hey, I'm paying, premium money for this American brand because, like, I want you to know I've got money. It's a status symbol. Like, that was a big thing of the culture, right? You wanted to wear Nikes. You wanted to have an Apple phone. You wanted everything to be American or foreign. German brands always did really well. Why? Because German products are always attributed with high quality, right? We always know the Germans do things very well. So if it's like, yeah, I just bought a Porsche, well, German car, great, engineering, awesome, quality, fantastic. But all that's shifted, right? Everything's shifted. So now you have local brands, right? Like Starbucks. At one point, this is in 2017, there was an article that came out on CNBC. Starbucks was opening a new store in China every 15 hours. Okay. A new Starbucks every 15 hours. It was gangbusters. Starbucks was a great stock to own for many years because of the China play. You go to Starbucks now in China, you can still find some busy Starbucks, but a lot of them are struggling because the domestic market is caught up. Chinese are saying, why am I paying $5 for a latte? Well, there's Chinese brands that actually make a better latte and is half the price, maybe a third of the price. And so it's actually like, I want to buy local. I want to buy Chinese. And so that's where we've seen a big shift in China as well, is that the domestic consumer is all about buying Chinese products now. So when you have like a DeepSeek moment came out, that was like a huge thing for the nation. People were like, man, this is awesome. Like, look at our engineers being able to develop something like that. Like we're coming up at the same level of the US. I mean, this is as good, if not better, than OpenAI. That's a huge testament to our engineers. That's a huge testament to our government. That's a huge testament to our nation. And that's kind of the sentiment that they feel.
What, but by the way, like, we'll have to talk about the thorium thing another time, but
Sure.
I don't know if you know, Wes, but it's such a cool technology. It's like going to be the power of nuclear without the risk. And the U.S. pioneered so much of that technology,
They did.
but then we let go of it. And
Yeah.
China decided to build out. And I don't know, it just seems like the right future. I mean, I love the idea of nuclear power, but not having the risk involved. So maybe we could switch the conversation to TikTok. So obviously it's kind of big news, I guess, that it's sort of sold and partially like some of the servers are in the US, but it's still kind of not ours. A little bit of algorithmic changes that we can see now should be important. It doesn't see, from what I understand, in China, there is no Facebook, there is no X or any of the American brands. What do you think about how we kind of have some of their social networks here, and we have in the past, but they haven't allowed ours to be there?
So that's a great question, and I've got a lot of experience on this, so I'm happy to chat about this. So the interesting thing about this is that China has a very strict policy on the data information. Okay. And so there's actually a big misconception here. A lot of people think that China has banned these companies from being there, right? Facebook, Twitter, or X, all of these social media platforms. In reality, they haven't banned them. It's the simple fact is that, for example, if you have Facebook wants to operate in China, the local Chinese rule is that the data information has to be stored on servers in China. No different than what the United States is asking right now, right? The United States says, hey, if you're TikTok and you want to operate here, all of the data from the users has to be stored on servers in the United States. It's literally the same policy from both countries. Now, of course, Facebook said, well, we're not building servers in China and we're not storing our information in China. So, okay, well, then you can't be here. So you're banned. So it's either like you comply with the local rules or you don't. Now, here's an interesting case study. LinkedIn, for many years, said, okay, we're in. Like we're gonna build servers there and we're gonna store our information there because we would actively like to be in China. So for many years, LinkedIn was the one social network that actually was able to be in China. Now, LinkedIn ended up pulling out of China, I'm gonna say about 3 years ago. And the simple thing is that it just couldn't make money there. It just never became popular. It wasn't really a good growth market for them. And the thing is that we have to remember with China is that, and I use Chinese social media apps. So, when you are a native Chinese speaker and you have Chinese social media apps, they're built in a much different way. And the easiest way I can say that is that if the three of us are using Instagram, it's built for the American consumer, right? It's in English, it's fun, like the interface is just built for us. China, they have a different way. So again, like it's hard to just say like, hey, we have Facebook, just translate everything from English to Chinese and just launch it in China. It doesn't work that way, right? So China has their own apps that they develop and they have unique Chinese features, and so for example, they have like different emojis, they have different, different features that, and how you can share things and how you can interact with your friends in a much different Chinese way. So it's like, how can Facebook, like how are we, let's just say the three of us, even me, like I speak Chinese, but I don't know how to build an app that's going to really cater to Chinese people, right? Like a Chinese guy's got to do that, right? Or a Chinese woman engineer, like somebody with that deep, intimate connection that knows what the Chinese user really wants. They're going to have to build that. So as far as those, Western companies, I think there's an interesting one as well, because Macron, the French president, he said a very interesting quote this week. And I don't know if you guys caught this. I'm going to say, he said, we made a very poor decision that we actually allowed these social media companies from both the United States and China into France because, we've given all our control to them. So he kind of called out China and TikTok, but he also called out obviously the United States, which is very big in France, because people are using Instagram or Facebook or WhatsApp. And so, this is actually, when we talk about national security and you want to talk about the risk, I mean, I always like to look at it on the other way too, because like all of Europe, for example, is basically, all of their information is stored on US servers, right? And so you kind of look at, the amount of leverage that the US has over Europe, and it's kind of shocking. And it was kind of amazing to hear France's president say that, like, I really regret that we have all these social media platforms in France and they're all controlled by the US government. And then, the TikTok thing. So as far as the TikTok deal, I'll answer that question. I think it's an interesting one because, there's a whole debate on the algorithm, right? Like who's controlling the algorithm, what's happening. The interesting thing is I definitely don't support a TikTok ban. I think that, I think for the majority of TikTok users, I don't think they really care if it's, okay, this is from China, like what is it? It's like, what? The interesting thing is that China actually did manufacture something that was able to compete. I mean, actually, if you go to, Jiang Yimin is the CEO of ByteDance that owns TikTok. This story about this is quite fascinating. Back when this would have been 10 years ago, more, maybe longer. I mean, he actually sat down with his team of friends in like a 2-bedroom apartment in Beijing. And he said, I want to build a social media platform, but I want it to be big. Like, I want to actually take on Facebook. Like, I actually want it to be a global brand, because you can develop a domestic social media company in China, and and it's a very lucrative market because you got 1.4 billion people. So you can totally tap that market and make, millions of dollars, no problem, billions of dollars. But to say I want to have TikTok really become a global brand, that was a great vision from, Jiang Yimin, to really go out and accomplish that. And that was why they actually structured it into 2 different versions. So I'm sure there's 2 versions of TikTok. There's one that's called TikTok, which is around the world. There's a domestic Chinese version called Douyin, and Douyin is the one that operates exclusively in China. And they do that because of the different internet laws, right? There's certain content that you can't put in China. There's certain internet laws, in order to operate in China. So that's the difference between the 2.
Yeah, I thought it was amazing that they shut down all the large language models there's some sort of a national sort of exam day where students, college students, university
the
students, yeah, and they shut down the equivalent of, every ChatGPT and DeepSeek and whatever, so it would not be used during that time. That I was like, wow, that's crazy. And I think TikTok, their version of TikTok, does not allow. There's something about targeting kids so that they keep studying. Just don't show them stupid content, I guess.
So what's really good. So I actually went on Piers Morgan about a year and a half ago. I was on his show and I was debating about TikTok, and I said, Piers, this is a really interesting thing. You might actually like this. So in China, everybody has to register, your ID card, to your social media platform. So it's direct. It'd be equivalent to like typing in your driver's license in order to sign up for Facebook or Instagram. Okay, so you have a record, and so they know, who's behind the brand and who's behind this, etc. So if you're under the age of 18, you have your ID card. You have to if you want to have your own phone and your own thing. Well, if you're under the age of 18, you're limited. They actually limit it to 60 minutes a day. And so their big debate is that, the guy that I was debating, he was a member of parliament, and he said, this is terrible. This is the government cracking down on freedom, and I said, you're not wrong. You're not wrong that it is certainly cracking down on freedom, but at the end of the day, as a parent, you're probably not upset that if you have an 11, 12-year-old kid, should they be doing more than 60 minutes a day? You could make the argument that should be the parent's responsibility, but let's be honest, in today's age, a lot of parents aren't around. And so all of a sudden and so that's actually Piers. It's like, Cyrus, you might be onto something here. Like that's not a bad idea. It's something to explore. It's something to have a chat about. And so again, the other gentleman that was debating, he was like, no, that's authoritarian, that's terrible, there's no freedom. And it was just more like, that's kind of an interesting thing. And I've actually talked to a lot of parents here in Las Vegas. I've got 3 kids myself, we're all at school. And so I tell this to all the parents, and they're like, that's a brilliant idea. Like nine out of 10 parents I talk to, they're like, oh, I love that idea, right? Like, to talk about teenage kids and how often they're on these social media platforms. If you got locked out, you got 60 minutes a day. That's not a bad thing. So again, we can have a debate on, is it authoritarian? Is it overstepping your freedoms? It's just an interesting perspective. But yes, that is how it works in China. And it's exactly. So the Gaokao, just so people don't know, the Gaokao is equivalent. It's your college entrance test. It is like the biggest test you ever take in China. It literally determines if you get in or out of college. And it's like a 2 or 3 day examination, depending on where you are in the country. But yeah, people study their whole lives, to take that test. And so, if you pass the Gaokao and you're going to get into a big school, like massive deal.
Yeah, that's so wild because, the idea, I think about it in food sometimes, like it's like in the US, sometimes there's just like really crappy food, right? Like we allow certain things in our food production line that China would have never allowed. But then again, it's also like, I guess the freedom to eat garbage, like that you want to debate. And I'm like, I don't know. I don't know where to draw the line on that.
Yeah, no, we're getting a little off topic, but I think it's relevant. So I lived in Canada for 5 years. And so what's interesting is in Canada, the amount of things banned from the United States is shocking. You just can't believe it. A simple example would be Fruit Loops. So you look at Fruit Loops and all of those are artificial coloring in the American version. Well, Fruit Loops in Canada, they have a completely different version. It's all made with natural, organic, for example, red that comes from beetroot, right? So they take the beetroot extract and they dye it. So the Fruit Loops in Canada, they're a much more duller color. They're not that bright, shiny red. It's more of it's a beetroot color. So it's kind of like a washed out purple, if you will. But it's obviously healthy. It's organic. It's definitely not a toxic chemical. And so I'm totally there, especially with a father of 3 children. We're looking at labels for our kids, and it's like when we're in Canada, we always love that because it's like, oh yeah, you could grab some Fruit Loops because those aren't bad for you. But then it's like, oh yeah, look at the American version, yellow 5, red 40, blue 1. You don't want to be putting that garbage in your body.
It's just the cost of freedom requires so much education and so much effort. You know what I mean? And like, I think we sometimes forget that as Americans. Like, yeah, we do have more freedom, but we have to now choose to eat the healthier thing and not be convinced by the marketing that red 5 is worth buying and boycott against it. And
yeah, totally. 100% with you there.
Maybe we could talk about the World Artificial Intelligence Conference that you recently attended. So I guess this would be the equivalent of something like CES in China, or maybe even bigger than that. But it's really where you get a sense to walk the floor, see the companies, and get a beat for where the most advanced AI in the country is. What did you learn from that event? How can you compare it to like kind of what we know in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say that, Dylan, that's a great question. So it is actually held every year in Shanghai. It was a great time to go. So it's the World AI Conference. And a couple takeaways that I had is that, number one, one of the things that we often hear in Western media is that China's collapsing, the economy is struggling right now. You go to that World AI Conference, and I'm not kidding, there must have been 300,000 or 400,000 people there. I mean, it was jam-packed in that area. I mean, it was wall-to-wall people. There was there's an amazing time to be in China because at exhibitions like this, there's a tremendous energy in the room because you're just surrounded by so many people, right? And so, for example, the big thing was really the robotics, right? So you had the Unitree robotics, and they had robots all over the store. So it's kind of, or the show floor, I should say. So it was kind of interesting because like everywhere you're going, you're seeing these robots walking down the aisle. People are taking pictures with them. They, you go for a coffee. It's a robotic barista making you a latte. It's like there's to scan the QR code to get into this place. Or you're interacting with a robot. It's just like, wow, and it's like, geez, it's kind of like a little thing of the future here. Like there's just robots everywhere. And then of course the cool thing is they really wanted to show you how advanced these robots are getting. So they had 2 of these Unitree robots, do a boxing match. And so that was they had a full boxing ring set up. And that was really the big draw. I mean, there was just tons of people around this. Everybody wanted to take a look at that. And you're just kind of, people are asking, like, well, what's the point of, 2 robots boxing? But it's talking about, how they're able to move. You're watching the footwork. You're watching it, like if somebody gets hit, how they fall down, how they get back up. And it's like, wow, that range of motion for this robot is pretty incredible. I mean, I do think that there will come a time where, for example, there's going to be a robot in your home and doing laundry, folding laundry and doing things like this. I mean, is it within the next year, 2 years? I don't know, but I do see that in our future. And so again, you're kind of seeing, they had production lines, where it's like, okay, in our factories, here are robots where they're sorting out, for example, piles of trash, where it's like, okay, this is paper, this is plastic, this is, cardboard. And, and you're just watching these robots move and able to determine what the materials are and then be able to sort them into their respective piles on the fly. I was like, wow, that's pretty amazing. So you're starting to see that. I spent some time at the Tencent booth, which is again, one of China's big tech companies. And so they had built, all of these AI different models that were really cool. So the biggest one that I thought was really amazing is they had partnered with China Southern Airlines, and they had built this entire flight simulator, all built with AI. And now China Southern pilots, they have to go through 1,000 hours of training on those simulators, before they're able to actually fly a real plane. So again, it's, I think this is very common. I mean, we're going to see AI obviously deployed in almost every industry, but again, it's just, you start seeing all of these, different things that are built, and all of these companies and people from around the world all going there. I think, again, we go back to that comment I made earlier as far as the elderly in China. There's going to be robots working in the elderly home, helping people get out of bed, helping people to get to the restroom, and so there was like, it's like, man, this is a pretty cool, piece of technology. There was another one was these robotic legs that you could actually basically strap up to your legs and you could actually, move, you actually move. And they actually, well, interesting enough, they actually like deploy these at tourist sites. So for example, if you've ever been to the Great Wall of China, those steps are extremely steep. It's actually I mean, even if you're, you're in great shape, you're super fit, like you're climbing that Great Wall of China, like that's a workout. Like you're going to be exhausted. So they sell you these robotic legs that you can just strap up and just help you move a little bit faster, just to make that more efficient. So it's pretty cool. I mean, you can see that I'm very excited about China. I'm very bullish about China. I always encourage people, like, even if you hate China or you don't know anything about it, like I would just encourage you to go there and experience it just to kind of get a little bit of perspective, just to kind of see, what's going on over there, because it's much more modern, much safer, much more futuristic than you probably would ever believe. And I've never met a foreigner that's been to China and not come back and just been like, wow, that really kind of exceeded my expectations. That really blew me away. It was nothing like I thought it would be. That's really the most common thing I've heard, especially in the last couple of years. If you went to China once in 1995, then it's basically an entirely different country now. I mean, you've got to go within. If you haven't been within the last couple of years, it's totally different.
It's amazing when they post certain videos online. Like just today, this morning, I think somebody posted like, "Here's a Chinese train station." I forget the name, but I was like, "What? This isn't some futuristic movie I'm watching." Sorry, did you say the name?
It's actually that video has been going viral on Twitter. I know exactly the one you're talking about. It's the world's largest train station, just opened in Chongqing. It's been trending, and they also just opened up the world's largest bridge as well, which has been trending on Twitter as well. So and I think there's a tough one, because I saw you remember the Baltimore bridge that collapsed? What was it, 18 months ago? So they showed the status of that being rebuilt. They're driving the first pylon into the water right now to help the rebuild. And it's like, okay, well, China just built the world's largest bridge. They did it for a budget of $300 million, and they completed it from scratch in 48 months. And it's like, what's going on in Baltimore? Like, what are we doing? So again, I'm not trying to say like U.S. is bad, China's good. It's just more, I think what the sentiment on Twitter is like, why can't we get our stuff together? Like, we should be doing this here, right? Like, we built the Golden Gate Bridge in like 3 years, I think, right? Like we got the engineering. I mean, and when was Golden Gate Bridge built? 70 years ago, 80 years ago, so.
Why is that? I mean, you brought the question up to just kind of chatting, but why is it? Do you think it's that we have 4-year terms and nobody thinks long term, or do you think the education system was built for the wrong era and it needs an overhaul? Or is it the competition between the provinces that we're missing?
A great question, Dylan. I mean, I think it's a little bit of all three of those. I think when you look at, the bureaucracy in the United States to get something done, like, hey, we want to build a new bridge, all of that, I mean, that you can't get started on that project for how long? 6 months to a year, because you got to get the permitting, you've got to get the plans, you've got to put it up to, to the community. Let's have a vote about it. Let's do this. Let's do that. I mean, there's a lot of red tape in order to do that. Whereas again, like in China, it's like, we're building a bridge. Okay. Like, when are we starting? We're starting next month. Okay, great. Like let's get the plans together and get it done. You talk about the skill set. There's a viral interview that I love, because, for example, it's from Tim Cook, CEO of Apple. And he said in an interview, he said, a lot of people misunderstand China. They think that we go to China to manufacture because it's cheap. Actually, it's not cheap. Like, China is much more expensive than people think it is to manufacture, especially when you're doing products like an iPhone. He said, we actually go to China because of the tooling engineers. He said, if I go in the United States right now and try to find the most advanced tooling engineers, I would be lucky to fill a classroom of them. I can go to China, I could fill multiple football fields filled with these tooling engineers. He's like, that's why we're in China, because of that ability and these people that could do that work. And so it's an amazing, it's an amazing thing when you actually look at, how the China system and how they're able to, how are they able to close that gap? When I started my geopolitics YouTube channel a few years ago, I mean, the gap between China and the United States in chips was miles. I mean, it was years. It's like we literally have a 5-year head start on China. And I mean, you guys know this. I mean, in order to close that gap, I mean, how do you close that gap? 5 years is an eternity. And that was the quote from Eric Schmidt. 5 years is an eternity in my mind. Right. And that was his famous thing. Like, U.S. has the lead. 5 years is an eternity. That was his exact quote. And then now it's just like, China's like, now you have Jensen Huang saying, China's nanoseconds behind. Like, they're closing that gap, and they're getting faster and better at doing this. So I think, when it comes down to it, I think it's a little bit of everything. It's a little bit of red tape in the government, little bureaucracy issues. I don't think you have the engineering and the people to do that. I mean, this is why this H1N visa is a very big deal, because you don't have, look at Silicon Valley. Look at how many of these engineers come from foreign countries. I mean, we don't have them here. It's not like Americans are being forced out of jobs. It's not like we're firing, able American engineers and then we're bringing in cheaper labor. Like, we don't have the people to do that. Silicon Valley was built on, immigration and these H1N visas.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's definitely one thing that's interesting to know. Like you just said, how many, just sheer number of STEM people coming out of certain countries. And China's probably, I'm sure, like leading by far. So the other thing you sometimes talk about is kind of where the different countries are besides China, besides US. Like, for example, recently, we saw Jensen Huang, Elon Musk, Sam Altman, Donald Trump, and all the cabinets, all the people helping him. They all went to the United Arab Emirates, talking to the leaders there, and seemingly saying that that's going to be a much bigger alliance, so to speak. They're going to be much closer, U.S. and the kingdom, as they refer to it. And they want to build the infrastructure on U.S. tech, the world infrastructure for AI, and instead of letting China build that out. So I'm curious, like, just for people that maybe don't follow the geopolitics, maybe don't really understand it, like, what's the top level thing of, like, where does India fall into that? Where's US, India, United Arab Emirates, China? Like, how's everybody sort of positioned in this space?
Yeah, that's a great question, Wes. So I think what's interesting here is, I mentioned this a little bit, is that we have this now multipolar world where the United States is not the sole superpower. So the U.S. was the sole superpower after World War II. And I would argue that really up until like kind of the mid-1990s, I would say the United States had a very nice, almost half-century time where, we're number one, and no one was close. You could make an argument that maybe the Soviet Union was a potential, threat to that, but Soviet Union was never an economic threat. It was maybe a military threat, but it never, could compete with the United States in that regard. But the rise of China is certainly something that has challenged that U.S. hegemony, because now countries have an option. And so now they can actually, figure out who they want to work with. And I think what we've seen with Donald Trump and his trade war and his presidency so far, at least during Trump 2.0, but also in Trump 1.0, is, with these trade wars, these are actually oftentimes very disruptive to the United States economy. Great example of this is if you look at the farming industry right now, soybean farmers, corn farmers, if you go talk to them right now, I mean, they're hurting big time here, because what's happened is that they had a very lucrative opportunity in the United States. 40% of the soybeans grown in this country has to be exported abroad, right? We produce way more than we can possibly consume. We don't eat soy products in the United States. It's not a big thing for us, right? We eat beef, we eat chicken, we eat certainly more meat products. So we have one of the most fertile lands in the world in order to grow these products, right? So we had a great relationship, right? China bought all of the soybeans. All of these soybean farmers made tons of money. But because of the trade war, and the way that, Trump was, positioning against China, China said, look, don't forget, we're the number one trading partner with many countries around the world. We have options, right? So for example, we're going to call up Argentina, Brazil. They have tons of soybeans, fantastic quality. We can bring those in as well. When Donald Trump started putting a tariff on Brazilian coffee exporters, right? The Brazilian beans now subject to, a nearly 45% tariff. Well, no one's going to buy Brazilian beans at 45% tariff, right? Don't forget, it's us that is buying the products, right? U.S. importers, we're paying the tariffs. So all of a sudden, Brazilian imports to the United States plummeted. Well, China said, don't worry, all you guys come to here, because China is one of the fastest growing coffee drinkers. So there's a great opportunity, for them. So I think, and back to your question, as far as the United Arab Emirates, where are all these people going? I always like to say that. I like to say that, again, I've been a long time shareholder in Nvidia. This is not investment advice, but just disclosure. But I mean, like, I think it's a great company, right? I think that they produce great products. I think China's producing great things. I think what we need to look at is we need to look at areas that we can all compete. Actually, if you go to the United Arab Emirates, their entire 5G network is built by Huawei. So, I mean, they have some of the most advanced 5G there, and Huawei absolutely dominates in the Middle East. So, you have a very interesting thing where, actually when you look at Huawei as a company, they have absolutely dominated across the world. I think out of the top 50 telecom companies in the world, 40 of them are working directly with Huawei in some capacity. So, they have a massive global reach. Actually, if you look at the continent of Africa, most of the 5G and especially certainly the 3G and 4G, their network was all built by China. So again, this is where China is looking at, what we call is the global South. So the global South is Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. 85% of the world lives in the global South, right? When you look at these North American countries, like obviously North America, Europe, we include Australia in this global North, that's only 15% of the population. So there's actually a huge opportunity in that global South. And so again, you're looking at, I think both countries can develop great tech. I think both countries can develop great hardware, and you're just going to see, both of them are going to have a lot of leverage, moving forward in the future.
Absolutely.
Gotcha. Wes, is there any final kind of questions you wanted to throw out there or anything?
This was incredibly good. The few questions that I was very curious in getting answered, I think we definitely nailed it. Is there anything that maybe we've missed, especially at that intersection of development of chips, AI, robotics? Any myths you want to dispel, or anything that we haven't covered, or anything that's just of interest to you that maybe we've missed?
I just want people to understand. I'm just going to leave you with this final thought, guys. So first of all, I really appreciate the invite to your channel.
Thank you so much. This has been great.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And I have a YouTube channel that I talk about China and I talk about geopolitics. And this channel started 5 years ago during COVID because I was very frustrated with the way that China was presented in the media. I think that there's a lot of positive stories from coming out of China. There's a lot of incredible tech. I'll tell you an interesting story. Chinese scientists actually invented a new bone glue. I don't know if you heard about this story. Okay, so they actually took the same technology that actually from oysters. You know how oysters actually attach themselves to something? They have this actual secretion of a glue. They actually made a glue that can actually heal fractures. So they can actually go in there, use this glue, and they can heal a fracture completely within like 2 days. And so it's like this amazing thing. Chinese scientists, they actually developed a cure in clinical trials right now for curing type 1 diabetes. They're moving the needle on so many of these things. And this is something that, I want people to understand, is that even in our medical industry in the United States, this is a really crucial point I want people to understand. When you look at the best American pharmaceutical companies, the best American doctors and what they're doing in pharmacists and doctors in these industries, they actually do a lot of those clinical trials in China. And the reason for that is because of the sample size. Right? China has 4 times the population. So when you're looking at, like, say, how do we treat this advanced disease? Well, actually, let's go to China, because 4 times the population, you're going to have 4 times as many patients with that disease. And so actually, there's a tremendous amount of collaboration between the U.S. and China when you really get to the details. So I just want my final message is, don't sleep on China, do more research about it, and really become curious, because this is a multipolar world. China's not going anywhere. It will be a superpower, and it will be a big force in the future of our world. So I would advise everybody to educate yourself about it. Educate yourself more about China and what they're doing. And if you haven't already, book a trip to China. I mean, just go there as a tourist. There's now 45 countries around the world that are visa-free, depending on your passport. Even for U.S. passport holders, you can get a 10-day transit visa. So that means you can fly into one city. Let's say you fly into Beijing. You can stay on the ground in China for 10 days and then fly out of a different city. So let's say you go to Beijing, fly out of Shanghai. You don't even need a visa. You can literally just go and book a flight there. But I would say, I would encourage people to really learn more about China, go experience it, and it will change how you see the world.
Yeah, that's great. Very well said. And certainly now that as the AGI race is heating up, I think more of us, wherever you are in the world, I think it's important to understand that where everybody is, how everything's progressing, because I think this is going to be a very crucial sort of a technological race. And I'm certainly one person that does not want to see conflict. We've seen these robots. We've seen how quickly they're progressing. We don't want to get into anything where there's military conflict. Keep everything peaceful. Get to know everybody and the neighbors, etc. So,
Amen.
Thank you so much for being here. This was an absolutely incredible interview. We'll leave all the links down below. I didn't know you started your channel in 2020. I mean, that was quite an incredible growth. So congratulations. You must be really, people are really finding value with it. And I'm certainly going to try to learn more about China and kind of where things are going. So
awesome.
thank you so much.
Dylan, thank you guys so much. I appreciate you both.